Why do I feel anxious when nothing bad is happening? Picture this. You're sitting on a couch on a Sunday afternoon and nothing is wrong. By every measurable external standard, things are just fine. There's no crisis, there's no deadline, and there's no threat that you can identify. But yet your chest still feels heavy, and you feel this tension in your shoulders that you can't release. So even though nothing bad is happening, your nervous system is still behaving as if there is. And this specific experience is one of the more confusing and more distressing features of what the clinical literature calls high functioning anxiety and what the neuroscience describes as chronic nervous system dysregulation. And it's confusing because it disregards the intuitive model of how anxiety is supposed to work. Anxiety is supposed to be a response to something genuinely threatening, not as something that operates somewhat independently of external conditions. And the clinical and neurological account of why this happens is more than just the generic "you're an anxious person" framing. The autonomic nervous system, which is a system that regulates the body's arousal level by managing the balance between the sympathetic nervous system's fight or flight activation and the parasympathetic nervous system's rest and digest state, is not simply just reactive, it's also predictive. And certain theories provide some of the most useful frameworks for understanding what's happening in chronic nervous system dysregulation. The nervous system is something that is continuously assessing the environment for cues of safety and threat through a process that is a below conscious scanning that is happening continuously, which is in the background before any conscious awareness of threat has formed. And this system is ancient and fast. It evaluates incoming sensory information for threat signatures before the cortex has a chance to continuously process what's being received. And in a nervous system that is well regulated through sufficient accumulated experience of genuine safety, that the environment is genuinely not threatening, then the system's baseline is set low. The system is running the scan, but the scan is mostly returning all clear results, and the activation level reflects that. So then the body is in a relatively relaxed state. But in a nervous system that has learned through accumulated experiences that their environments are genuinely threatening, then the baseline system is set differently. The scans continue to run, but it's calibrated towards finding threat rather than towards confirming safety. And the threshold for activating the sympathetic stress response is lower. And the result of that is a body activated in some degree of its fight or flight state, even when the external environment is presenting no real threat. So that Sunday afternoon chest heaviness that I spoke about earlier is the body running a threat response in a threat-free environment. And that's not because something is wrong with your assessment of the environment, but instead because the system that regulates your activation level is calibrated to a higher set point than the current environment requires. There's a specific neurochemical mechanism that explains why certain calm environments just don't fail to feel peaceful for chronic anxious people, but actively feel uncomfortable. The body regulates its own neurochemical environment through feedback mechanisms that are designed to maintain homeostasis, which is to keep the internal chemical environment within a range that allows the system to function. When any neurochemical is present at a consistently elevated level for a sustained period, then the body adapts to that elevation as the new normal. It reduces the sensitivity of the relative receptors, adjusting the baseline production of the neurochemical and recalibrating the system around the elevated level rather than around the original baseline. Which brings me to cortisol, which is your primary stress hormone, and its release to those perceived threats. and it's subject to that adaptation. So the person who's been chronically activated and whose cortisol has been running at elevated levels for months or years in response to chronic stress then develops that specific adaptation where your elevated cortisol becomes your new baseline. And the physiological state corresponds with that. So that peaceful Sunday afternoon in this context is not relief. It's a deviation from the baseline. The body that is now in absence of the stressors it's been maintaining at that adapted level experiences something like a withdrawal, like uneasiness or anxiety, or the sense that something is wrong. Because physiologically, something is different than what the adapted system has come to expect. This is the mechanism behind the phenomenon of people who feel more comfortable in genuinely stressful situations than in peaceful ones. It's not that they enjoy stress, it's that their neurochemical baseline has adapted to that stress level. So now the stress feels like normal, while the calm feels like dysregulation. So in those situations, in a specific neurochemical sense, the body is missing its drug because it's missing the anxiety when nothing bad is happening. That chronic stress adaptation produces a neurochemical dependency on the elevated cortisol state. So now let's get into the high functioning anxiety profile, because high functioning anxiety is not a formal diagnosable category. It doesn't appear in the DSM in those terms, but it describes a clinically recognizable pattern that is distinct enough in its presentation to deserve examination as a coherent profile. The high functioning anxious person appears from the outside as doing well. They're productive and often highly productive because the chronic activation of the sympathetic nervous system produces a low-level urgency that drives sustained effort and output. They're also reliable because the anxiety is partly managed through control. So by ensuring that things are done correctly and on time, and that no situation deteriorates to the point where the anxiety's predictions come true. And lastly, they're organized, because organization is a form of threat management. It's a way of reducing the environmental variables that the scanning system might flag as potential threats. So from the inside, the experience is considerably more complex. The productivity is partly being driven by the anxiety rather than by genuine motivation, which means it doesn't produce the same kind of satisfaction that genuine motivation-driven work produces. And the second thing is that the reliability is being partly compelled by the anxiety rather than by genuine commitment, which means it generates resentment in proportion to the compulsion. And third and lastly, underneath all of the functional output, the nervous system is still running a continuous background program of threat scanning, contingency planning, worst case modeling, and preparation for threats that almost never happen. And the specific internal experiences that characterize high functioning anxiety include the following. First is the inability to fully relax, even in objectively safe environments. The relaxation is possible sometimes, but there's a quality of effortfulness to it. This feeling of having to actively work at being at ease rather than just being at ease naturally. There's the racing or looping thoughts, which normally happen in the late evening or early morning when the external demands that had been occupying your conscious attention during the day are no longer providing that distraction. The second thing is the physical manifestations, which appear as the tension in specific muscle groups or the shallow breathing pattern that's become habitual, maybe even the digestive disruption or the difficulty sleeping. And for all of these, the person has often had for so long that they've ceased to identify them as anxiety symptoms and simply experience them as their body's normal functioning. And third and lastly could be the specific hypervigilance to relationship cues and social cues that the threat scanning system applies to interpersonal environments with the same level of diligence it applies to everything else. So the nervous system's calibration is not genetically fixed. It's substantially shaped by early experiences of an environment that either provided or failed to provide the co-regulation that developing nervous systems require. Studies on affect regulation and the developing brain describes how infants and young children regulate their own nervous systems primarily through the nervous system of the primary caregiver. In a process called co-regulation, which is when the caregiver's regulated calm nervous system literally transmits signals through their facial expressions, tone of voice, or touch that helps the child's developing nervous system settle from aroused states. So the capacity for self-regulation, which is the ability to return to a calm state after activation, or to tolerate distress without being overwhelmed by it, then develops through the accumulated experience of co-regulation. So the child who had access to consistent, attuned co-regulation, where their primary caregiver was emotionally available and responsive in ways that helped the child's nervous system settle when it was dysregulated, then develops a nervous system with a well-calibrated baseline and a strong capacity for self-regulation. And this doesn't mean that that child will never experience anxiety. It just means that their system knows how to return to a settled state after activation. But for the child who lacked access to that consistent co-regulation, where their primary caregiver was emotionally unavailable, overwhelmed, or inconsistently present, then they develop a nervous system whose self-regulation capacity is less developed. Their baseline is calibrated towards a higher activation, and their experiences of genuinely safe environments may be so limited that the neuroception system hasn't accumulated enough safety data to distinguish reliably between threatening and non-threatening environment cues. And the adult with a chronically dysregulated baseline may have had no single dramatic trauma that produced the dysregulation, because the dysregulation is the accumulated outcome of the absence of something. It's not necessarily the presence of something dramatic. So that should remove the implicit blame that is attached to chronic anxiety when it's framed as a personal failing or a thinking problem. Because the nervous system's calibration is not primarily a product of how you think about things. Instead, it's a product of what your nervous system was taught to expect through years of accumulated experiences. And that recalibration of that expectation requires more than thinking differently. So now let's get into the threat scanning system and what it's looking for. The threat scanning system doesn't simply evaluate the environment for objective threats, it evaluates the environment for signals. And the signals it's calibrated to find are specific to the threat patterns it's been trained on. For most chronically anxious people, the threat patterns are relational rather than physical. The scanning system is looking primarily for social and interpersonal threat signals. That slight change in someone's tone of voice, or the brief facial expression that might indicate displeasure, or maybe the message that took longer to arrive than you were expecting. But all of these microsignals are processed by the scanning system with significantly greater intensity than their objective threat level warrants, because the scanning system is calibrated to a relational threat history that attached high significance to exactly these kinds of microsignals. The hypervigilance to relational cues that characterizes anxiety is not irrationality. It's the expression of a scanning system that learned that small changes in relational signals could be meaningfully predictive of significant subsequent events. So, in the original environment, normally the childhood environment where the threat scanning calibration happened, small shifts in the caregiver's emotional state might genuinely have predicted significant subsequent changes in the child's experience. So that sensitivity was adaptive. But the problem is now that the application of the same sensitivity to adult environments don't share the original environment's actual threat structure. And the scanning system also does something different with ambiguous information. Ambiguity in situations where the threat level is genuinely unclear and the signal can be read as either threatening or non-threatening tends to be resolved in the threatening direction by a dysregulated nervous system. This produces that experience of assuming the worst that chronically anxious people recognize as a persistent feature of their relational experience. And unfortunately, telling yourself to calm down doesn't work because the neuroception system operates below the level of conscious cognitive control. It receives information and generates a response faster than your cortex can formulate a conscious assessment of the situation. So by the time you have the conscious thought that there's nothing to worry about, your threat response system has already activated and the cortisol is already in circulation. So your conscious thought is responding to an already activated nervous system. It's not preventing the activation. This is why trying to talk yourself out of anxiety through reasoning is normally ineffective. That reasoning will engage with your cortex, which has some capacity to modulate your limbic system's threat response downward, but it still doesn't recalibrate its baseline. And changing it requires providing your nervous system with new experiences, not new thoughts. So now for the answer. What actually recalibrates your nervous system? The first thing you could try is extended exhalation breathing techniques. Breathing with a longer exhale than inhale directly activates the parasympathetic nervous system, and the specific ratio that research supports for this is approximately a 4-count inhale and an 8-count exhale. The ratio matters less than the principle. Just make sure that the exhale is significantly longer than the inhale. And this is not a cure for chronic dysregulation. It's an acute intervention that directly shifts the physiological state in real time, providing the nervous system with a brief experience of activation that can interrupt the chronic sympathetic dominance. So if practiced consistently, this will slowly shift the set point. Since the nervous system's baseline recalibrates through accumulated experiences of safe environments, not through the cognitive conviction that the environments are safe, because that safe environment still needs to be registered as safe. So then mindfulness practices in this context are not primarily about relaxation. They're about training the scanning system to also register safety signals and not only threat signals. Now, the dysregulation is often primarily rooted in early relational experience and is expressed most prominently in relational hypervigilance. And the relational context is where the most powerful recalibration tends to occur. So with sustained experiences of secure attachment, which can be in the forms of therapeutic relationships, friendships, or romantic partnerships with securely attached people, then this will provide the co-regulation that the developing nervous system didn't receive sufficiently in its earlier years. Also, there are physical interventions such as movement and cold that directly affect the nervous system's physiological state, such as regular exercising and cold exposure, which have clear evidence bases for their effects on chronic sympathetic activation than most cognitive interventions. Exercise provides the nervous system with an appropriate activation and recovery cycle that tends to reset the dysregulated activation baseline. And cold exposure through cold showers or cold water immersion activates the nerves directly and produces a measurable response. And the most important thing to not do is to not get enough sleep, because sleep deprivation directly increases the activation and threat sensitivity, which makes everything worse. So the good news is that you can always change your nervous system, but the bad news is that it won't happen overnight.